The apartment above it was the kind of apartment building no one looked twice at. A dull, gray slab wedged between two convenience stores on a busy street. Hader had moved into his unit only 3 weeks earlier, attracted by the cheap rent and the fact that the landlord didn't ask too many questions. His studio apartment was small but manageable. One window overlooking the street, a creaky bathroom door, and an old radiator that clicked to life at night. Nothing about it seemed unusual until he began to notice the strange noises above his ceiling. At first, he thought it was just a neighbor dragging furniture, but the longer he stayed, the more unsettling it became. The footsteps didn't sound like pacing. They sounded like someone was dragging their feet slowly, deliberately, back and forth. One night, when he couldn't sleep, Hader sat upright in bed and strained to listen. The sound of faint scratching echoed above him, rhythmic and intentional, as though someone was carving into the ceiling itself. His stomach tightened. The building was old, yes, but there hadn't been anyone living in the apartment above his. The landlord had mentioned during the signing that the upper floor was under renovation and completely unoccupied. Hader replayed those words in his head as the scraping above grew louder, closer, almost like it was directly above his bed. That night, he left the lights on, too uneasy to fall asleep. The next day, Hader decided to casually mention it to his landlord, Mr. Farouk, a graying man with sunken eyes who always seemed impatient. "There's someone upstairs, I think," Hader said cautiously. Farouk's face tightened before softening into a forced laugh. "Impossible," he replied flatly. "No one has access. The upper floor is sealed off." But his voice cracked slightly on the last word, and Hader caught it. He didn't push further, though the seed of dread had been planted deeper. That evening, Hader bought a small, cheap hidden camera online. He told himself it was for his own peace of mind, to capture proof of whatever was happening above him. When the package arrived, Hader set it up discreetly on the shelf across from his bed. It was no bigger than a matchbox, blinking a faint red light he covered with tape. That night, as he lay down with his headphones off and his nerves frayed, he heard the scratching again. This time, however, it was followed by something else, a hollow thud, then silence, then a low dragging sound, as if something heavy was being pulled across the floor. The air in his apartment grew heavier, thick with unease. His heart thudded in his chest as he stared up at the ceiling, wondering what the camera might be catching while he lay frozen in bed. The following morning, Hader connected the camera to his laptop. He skimmed through hours of footage until he froze. Around 3:17 a.m., the faint glow of streetlights through his window revealed something subtle but undeniable. Dust falling gently from the ceiling above, disturbed by movement. For nearly 10 minutes, the footage showed thin streams of white particles drifting down, almost like someone was crawling directly above him. But just before the recording ended, Hader noticed something else in the corner of the frame. The faint outline of a human hand pressing down against the ceiling plaster, fingers stretching as though testing for weakness. The first playback, Hader couldn't shake the image of the hand pressing against his ceiling. All day at work, the thought gnawed at him, and by evening, he was no closer to finding a logical explanation. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, he reasoned, or maybe the old plaster ceiling was bowing under its own weight. Still, he felt a strange unease lingering in his stomach, the same way one might feel after brushing past a stranger in a dark alley. That night, he placed the camera again, this time angled slightly upward, hoping to catch more of the ceiling directly above his bed. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound in the building seemed amplified, from the groan of water pipes to the faint hum of traffic outside. At around 2 a.m., Hader's body jerked awake as though something had startled him. The room was quiet, too quiet, with only the steady tick of his old wall clock breaking the silence. He stared up at the ceiling, half expecting the dragging sounds to begin again, but the stillness was absolute. He forced himself to stay in bed until dawn, even though he barely closed his eyes. When morning arrived, he brewed a cup of bitter instant coffee and sat before his laptop, heart pounding as he opened the night's footage. The first few hours were uneventful, nothing but Hader tossing in bed. Then, just past 2:12 a.m., the footage grew unsettling. A faint ripple spread across the ceiling above, like something shifting its weight. Plaster dust fluttered down, catching the dim glow of the street lamp. But then, suddenly, the video caught movement. a line appearing along the ceiling, jagged and thin, as though the plaster itself was splitting open. For several seconds, a shadow slipped into view, elongated, distorted, moving slowly along the crack. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but Hader slammed the pause button, rewinding again and again. The shape was an animal. It wasn't pipes or dust. It looked like an arm, bent unnaturally, disappearing back into the ceiling that a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. His mind spun in circles. If the upper apartment was sealed, how could someone be inside? And more importantly, why were they pressing against his ceiling in the dead of night? With shaking hands, Hader decided to confront the landlord once more. He marched to Farouk's cramped office downstairs and demanded answers. But Farouk's face grew stiff when Hader mentioned footage. He waved his hands dismissively, insisting the old building simply settles at night. The dismissiveness only made Hader more suspicious. Farouk's eyes flicked nervously toward the staircase leading up, just for a second, but it was enough to confirm that he was hiding something. That night, Hader set the camera again, but this time he positioned it not only toward the ceiling but also angled at his door. If there really was someone inside the building, someone moving unseen, they might not stay confined above forever. He sat awake for hours, every muscle tense, until exhaustion finally dragged him into a shallow sleep. When he awoke in the morning, sunlight streaming in through the curtains, he rushed to review the recording. At first, it was just as before, the plaster dust, the faint ripple. But then, around 3:04 a.m., his breath caught in his throat. The doorknob to his apartment door turned slowly, almost imperceptibly, as though tested from the other side. The scratching returns. Hader sat frozen at his desk, staring at the paused frame of his doorknob twisting in the dead of night. The rational part of his mind fought for an explanation. An old building, faulty locks, maybe even a draft. But deep inside, he knew none of those excuses made sense. Someone had been outside his apartment, turning that knob. The thought made his skin crawl. That evening, he bought a metal chair and jammed it under the handle before going to bed. It didn't make him feel safer, but it gave him the illusion of control. He placed the camera again, angled precisely to catch both ceiling and door, then climbed into bed with his phone clutched in his hand like a lifeline. The scratching began shortly after midnight. At first it was faint, like nails grazing stone, but soon it grew louder, sharper, echoing across the ceiling in drawn-out strokes. Hader pulled his blanket up to his chin, eyes darting between the ceiling and the door. Then, after several minutes of silence, the sound came again, but this time it wasn't from above. It came from the hallway just beyond his door, soft and deliberate, like fingernails slowly tracing the wood. His heart pounded so loudly he thought it would give him away. The chair wedged against the knob rattled slightly as though tested, then stilled. For the first time, Hader realized that whoever, or whatever, was up there wasn't just confined to the ceiling. They were moving. The next morning, with hands trembling, Hader pulled up the footage. He watched himself tossing restlessly in bed while the faint white flakes of plaster snowed down. Then, around 2:48 a.m., the camera caught it clearly. A long, pale hand poking briefly through the cracked ceiling, as though testing the air. The fingers stretched unnaturally long, jointed in too many places, before curling back into the shadows. Later, at exactly 3:03 a.m., the camera captured the door. The chair under the knob trembled, shifting slightly. And then, just for a second, the narrow outline of an eye appeared between the door frame and the wood itself, watching. Hader recoiled from the laptop, while rising in his throat. He wanted to leave, to pack a bag and never return, but his pride and curiosity warred against his fear. Who was up there? How could they have gone unnoticed? He decided to confront the landlord one final time, his patience fraying. But when he stormed down to the office, the door was locked and the lights off. A single piece of paper was taped to the window, closed until further notice. It felt deliberate, like Farouk had vanished the moment Hader began asking too many questions. That night, the scratching returned with a vengeance. It was louder, closer, no longer content with faint traces. Something shifted above the ceiling, the crack groaning as if ready to give way. Dust rained down steadily, coating the bedspread in a pale layer. Hader barely slept, his eyes glued to the trembling plaster above. Every so often, The faint outline of fingers would press against the surface, lingering as though savoring the tension. By dawn, his nerves were shredded, his body heavy with exhaustion. He promised himself, if something touched him tonight, if the ceiling gave way, he was leaving for good. The ceiling gives by the fourth night. Hader's nerves were shredded to threads. His body shook even as he tried to drink water, hands barely steady enough to grip the glass. Every sound in the apartment now carried weight. The radiator's hiss, the creak of old wood, the faint hum of street traffic beyond the curtains. Yet none of it could drown out the memory of that pale, searching eye at his door. He thought about leaving, about sleeping in his car or checking into a cheap motel, but the idea of abandoning the footage, the only evidence he had, kept him rooted. Some part of him needed to know, to see for himself what lived above. That night, he repositioned the camera to stare directly at the widening crack in the ceiling. If it broke open, he wanted proof. The scratching began earlier than usual, just past midnight. This time, it was accompanied by a groaning sound, as though wooden beams were bowing under immense weight. Dust fell steadily, coating his pillow in white. Hader lay still, wide-eyed, trying not to breathe too loudly. And then, with a sharp pop, a thin strip of plaster split away and tumbled onto the bed beside his face. He bolted upright, staring as the crack yawned wider, revealing pure darkness beyond. For a long, dreadful moment, nothing emerged, only silence, deep and suffocating. Then came a sound he would never forget, a wet inhale, muffled but close, as if something just above the ceiling had drawn a slow breath. The footage captured it all. At 12:47 a.m., the crack widened on screen, flakes of plaster raining downward. A pale shape appeared, first fingers, then the outline of a hand, trembling as it pushed against the opening. But the most horrifying detail came seconds later. A face pressed against the gap, impossibly close, skin stretched and gray beneath the thin plaster. Its eyes were wide and reflective, darting back and forth, searching the room as though studying Hader while he slept. The camera caught every detail, the flared nostrils, the twitching lips, before the thing pulled back into the shadows. The hole remained, gaping like a wound in the ceiling. Hader couldn't finish the footage. He slammed the laptop shut, stomach turning. His mind raced. A squatter? A madman living in the walls? Or something else entirely? The footage ruled out accidents or tricks of the light. There was something there, alive, breathing above him. His chest tightened as paranoia sank its teeth in. He kept glancing up at the ceiling, expecting another fragment of plaster to fall. It wasn't just his home anymore. Someone else had claimed it. The realization gnawed at him. If it could watch him at night, it could reach him, touch him, take him. When dawn finally arrived, Hader couldn't take it anymore. He dragged his mattress to the far corner of the room, away from the damaged ceiling, and shoved his dresser beneath the crack like a makeshift barricade. It wouldn't stop anything determined, but it made him feel less exposed. The hole above remained, jagged and black, a silent reminder that whatever was up there could return whenever it pleased. He left the camera rolling again, praying it would remain empty, but deep down, he already knew the worst was yet to come. The thing in the hallway the third night after the knocking was the worst yet. Nadia tried to keep Saad in her room so he wouldn't be alone, but the boy refused to sleep. He sat upright on her bed, eyes glued to the darkened hallway outside her door, as though waiting for something to emerge. "It's there," he whispered hoarsely, clutching a pillow against his chest. "It keeps standing in the hall." Nadia tried to reassure him, but her own nerves betrayed her. She could feel it too. The house seemed to breathe heavier at night, each creak and sigh of the wood echoing like a heartbeat. Around 2 in the morning, Saad shook her awake, his small hand trembling violently against her arm. "Look," he hissed, pointing to the half-open door. At first, she saw nothing but shadow. But then it appeared, tall, impossibly thin, its outline flickering as if it were stitched together from the darkness itself. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side, watching them. Nadia's breath caught, her chest locking in terror. She shut her eyes tightly, praying it was a trick of her imagination. When she opened them again, the figure was gone, but the whispers were louder, filling the room like a chorus just beyond the walls. Desperate to distract herself, Nadia pulled the old note from her pocket and read it under the weak glow of her bedside lamp. Don't listen when it calls your name. Don't answer the door after midnight. Don't stay in the dark. Her stomach nodded. Every warning was already happening. Saad's lips quivered as he whispered, "It already knows our names." His words hung in the air, heavier than the silence that followed. Nadia realized then that the note wasn't a warning for strangers. It was a record of survival, or maybe a failed attempt at it. Someone before them had fought the same thing. The night stretched on endlessly. At one point, Nadia thought she heard soft scratching at her bedroom walls, like fingernails dragging slowly across plaster. She pressed her ear against the wallpaper, and the sound stopped, only to resume directly behind her, on the opposite wall. Saad buried himself under the blankets, muffling his sobs. Nadia wanted to run, to leave the house entirely, but she couldn't bring herself to step into that hallway where the figure had been. The darkness outside her door was no longer just absence of light. It was occupied by morning. Their fragile grip on normalcy had shattered. Saad barely touched his breakfast, staring blankly at the window. It stood closer last night, he muttered. Nadia pretended not to hear, but her own hands trembled as she poured water into a glass. She couldn't shake the image of that shadowy figure lingering at her door, watching. And though daylight had returned, the feeling remained. This was no longer just a haunted house. This was a trap, and they had already stepped too far inside to escape easily. Nowhere to run by morning, Hader could hardly stand. His body felt brittle, his nerves completely eroded. He had proof now, proof no one would believe. He thought of the landlord, of Farouk's evasive eyes, and the shuttered office. Whatever was happening in this building, Farouk knew, and Hader suspected that's why the rent was so low. That evening, he stuffed a duffel bag with what little he owned. He told himself he'd leave, just walk out the door and never return. But when he reached for the knob, he froze. Deep scratches lined the wood around the lock, fresh ones, as though something with long nails had clawed at it from the inside. His stomach turned. The door wasn't an exit anymore. It was another barrier. Hader returned to the corner of the room, trembling, and glanced up at the hole in the ceiling. It looked larger than before, the plaster broken away like rotting wood, edges jagged. He stacked more furniture beneath it, his dresser, his nightstand, even the chair from the door, until the pile was a crude barricade. It gave him no comfort. He set the hidden cameras again, one toward the ceiling, another on the door, and sat in silence, waiting. The sun sank, shadows lengthened, and soon the only light in the room came from the weak glow of the street lamp outside. Just before 2 a.m., the scratching began again. It wasn't cautious this time. It was furious, scraping and tearing, plaster raining down like snow. Hader clamped a hand over his mouth, heart hammering. On the footage, the hole widened violently as something slammed against the barricade from above. The camera caught the dresser shuddering under sudden weight, wood creaking as pale limbs forced their way down. For a moment, the creature's face appeared again, upside down, hair dangling in brittle strands, mouth stretched open in what almost looked like a grin. Then, with inhuman strength, it shoved the barricade aside like children's toys. Hader bolted to his feet, but the thing was already in the room. It crawled down the wall like an insect, limbs jerking in sharp, twitching motions, head cocked at unnatural angles. Its eyes glistened in the half-dark, unblinking, fixed directly on him. He staggered toward the door, yanking at the knob, but the chair wedged beneath it earlier had jammed tight. He pulled, kicked, rammed his shoulder against it, all while the creature crept closer, its twitching smile widening with each jerk of its head. In his panic, Hader heard something that chilled him deeper than anything else. The sound of breath, hot and wet, not from him, but from the thing just behind his ear. The footage ended with Hader collapsing against the door, his face twisted in terror as the creature stood only feet away. One of its long arms stretched toward him, claws grazing the air, before the screen cut to static. When Hader woke the next morning, slumped against the wall, the furniture was back in place beneath the hole, as though nothing had happened. His cameras had stopped recording halfway through the night, files corrupted, but the claw marks on the door, deeper and sharper now, told him the footage hadn't lied. He wasn't imagining any of it. And whatever this thing was, it wasn't leaving until he broke first. The watching game Hader barely functioned the following day. He sat in the corner of his apartment, eyes bloodshot, mind unraveling under exhaustion. Every creak of the building, every faint knock in the pipes, sounded like a signal from the thing above. His duffel bag still sat by the door, but something in him knew escape wasn't as simple as turning the handle. It was watching him. He felt it in the weight of the silence, in the oppressive sense that he was never alone anymore. The cameras had become his lifeline. If he couldn't trust his own senses, he could at least trust the recordings. That night, he angled one camera to face himself while he slept and another directly at the ceiling hole. It was a decision he'd regret. Around 2:20 a.m., the scratching began as always, but softer, slower, almost playful. On the footage, flakes of plaster drifted like ash as a pale hand stretched down, but it didn't enter the room. Instead, it hovered, fingers twitching, as though testing Hader's reactions. On the second camera, Hader could be seen tossing, stirring, opening his eyes briefly as if sensing the presence. The creature's hand paused, frozen midair. Then, horrifyingly, it turned toward the camera itself, curling its fingers in slow, deliberate motion, as though it understood it was being recorded. When Hader reviewed the footage the next morning, his stomach turned. The way the hand had moved wasn't random, it was controlled, intentional. And when he rewound the video frame by frame, he noticed something worse. In one still, the fingers weren't just twitching, they were forming shapes. Letters. On the wall just above the lens, the shadows spelled out something crude but unmistakable. See you. His breath caught in his throat as the realization hit. It wasn't just aware of him. It was communicating. That night, Hader didn't bother with the barricade. What was the point? Instead, he sat awake with the lights on, clutching a kitchen knife he had pulled from the drawer. Hours dragged on until, sometime after 3 a.m., the doorknob rattled violently. The camera caught it twisting back and forth, harder and harder, until the chair beneath it snapped aside. The door creaked open just an inch, then stopped. On the recording, the pale reflection of an eye gleamed in the crack, unblinking. Hader lunged forward, slamming it shut and driving the chair back into place. He pressed his body against the wood, trembling as the scratching began again from the ceiling above, louder than ever. By dawn, Hader was beyond exhaustion. He hadn't slept in 2 nights. His apartment now bore scars, claw marks along the door, broken plaster, toppled furniture. His food supplies were low, and even leaving to buy groceries filled him with dread. How could he step into the hallway knowing something might be waiting above, or even behind the next door? He sat at the table, laptop glowing, footage still paused on the words traced in shadow. For the first time since moving in, he admitted it aloud in a hoarse whisper. It's not leaving. Face to face, the air in the apartment had changed. Hader felt it the moment night fell, thicker, heavier, almost damp with an unnatural humidity. The hole in the ceiling gaped wider now, an open maw spilling dust and fragments with each groan of the old building. Hader no longer dared to sleep. Instead, he sat in the farthest corner of the room, knife in hand, his hidden cameras blinking faintly in the shadows. He whispered to himself just to hear a human voice. Every second stretched longer than the last, the silence broken only by the ticking of the clock. But deep down, he knew tonight would not end quietly. At 3:14 a.m., the cameras caught the first movement. A pale arm slid through the ceiling, followed by another, skeletal fingers clawing for purchase on the dresser below. The footage showed the dresser shift under the weight as the creature lowered itself slowly, its head emerging with that same twitching, too wide grin. But unlike before, it didn't retreat. It descended fully this time, limbs cracking and jerking as they stretched, until it crouched in the center of the room, towering over the mess of plaster and splintered furniture. For the first time, Hader saw it standing fully upright. It was tall, too tall for the room, its spine hunched unnaturally, its elongated limbs trembling as though they were barely holding its skin in place. Hader froze, barely daring to breathe. The creature's head jerked from side to side in sharp, unnatural movements, its nostrils flaring as it sniffed the air. Then its eyes locked onto him. The footage showed the moment perfectly. Hader, trembling in the corner, knife clenched tight, staring at a nightmare that now stood only feet away. The creature tilted its head, studying him like a child watching a trapped insect. Then it did something that chilled him more than any noise or gesture yet. It slowly lifted one long finger and pressed it against its own lips in a perfect imitation of SHH. Hader's body convulsed with terror. He staggered to his feet, raising the knife, but the thing moved faster than he could process. In a blur of jerking limbs, it crossed the room, slamming its long hand against the wall beside his head. Dust and chips of paint rained down as it loomed over him, its breath hot and damp against his face. He gagged at the smell, rot, mildew, and something coppery. Its wide, unblinking eyes stared into his, and for one awful moment, Hader felt sure it was about to tear him apart. But then, just as suddenly, it pulled back, crawling with inhuman speed up the wall and back into the ceiling, vanishing into the blackness. When dawn broke, Hader collapsed onto the floor, his knife clattering away. His hands were cut and bleeding from gripping the blade so tightly. He replayed the footage with trembling fingers, watching himself face the thing head-on. The image of it pressing a finger to its lips burned itself into his mind. It wasn't just toying with him anymore. It was warning him, telling him to stay quiet, to not tell. The thought gnawed at him as the daylight filtered weakly through the curtains. If it wanted him dead, it would have killed him. So what was it waiting for? The escape attempt. Hader knew he couldn't survive another night in that room. His nerves were shredded, his hands raw from gripping the knife, his body trembling from sleeplessness. The thing hadn't killed him when it had the chance, but he felt sure it was only because it wanted something else. He couldn't risk staying to find out what. As the sun bled through his thin curtains that morning, he resolved, tonight he would leave. No more waiting. No more recording. He would take the duffel bag by the door, break the lock if he had to, and run until the building was just a gray block in the distance. Still, when evening came, he couldn't stop himself from setting the cameras again. It was a compulsion now, like documenting proof was the only way to keep control. He angled one toward the ceiling as always, but placed another outside in the hallway, slipping it just past his cracked door. It was risky, but he needed to know if the thing moved beyond his apartment. His chest tightened as night settled in, every shadow stretching long across the walls. He sat fully clothed, bag at his feet, knife in his lap, eyes locked on the door. Around 2:50 a.m., the footage from the hallway camera began to glitch. The grainy black and white screen flickered, distorted, until the image sharpened again. At the end of the long, narrow hallway, something was moving. Not walking, crawling. Limbs jerked in unnatural patterns as a pale form scuttled along the ceiling itself, clinging upside down, head twitching back and forth as if scanning for prey. Its elongated limbs scraped the paint, leaving deep grooves. And then, to Hader's horror, the hallway footage revealed more. From the shadows of the other sealed apartments, other shapes stirred. Smaller, thinner, moving in similar jerks, as though answering some unheard signal. Inside his apartment, Hader's doorknob rattled violently. He lunged to his feet, grabbing his bag and tearing the chair from beneath the handle. The footage caught him wrenching the door open and stumbling into the hallway. His breathing was ragged, his knife clenched tight, the camera recording every frantic movement. But when he turned his head, his blood froze. Half a dozen figures were clinging to the ceiling above, pale limbs quivering, wide reflective eyes staring down at him. Their twitching grins stretched impossibly wide as they scuttled toward him in silence, jerking like broken marionettes. Hader sprinted, his footsteps echoing down the hallway as the creatures crawled in pursuit. The hidden hallway camera captured it all, his desperate dash, the grotesque figures swarming behind him, moving too fast, too fluid, their limbs bending in ways no humans could. He slammed against the stairwell door, shoving it open, and disappeared into the dark. The footage ended there, static swallowing the screen as the pale shapes dropped from the ceiling and followed. The last recording Hader's footsteps thundered down the stairwell, each echo chased by the twitching scrapes of the creatures above. The hidden camera footage, recovered later, showed him fumbling with the railing as pale shapes clung to the walls behind him, heads snapping from side to side, limbs jerking too fast to follow. His duffel bag swung wildly as he nearly tripped, catching himself on the rusted banister. He slammed through the exit door, bursting into the night air, chest heaving. The city was silent at that hour, the neon glow of convenience stores flickering faintly across the empty street. For a moment, he thought he had made it. The hallway camera didn't lie, though. Seconds after he vanished, the creatures swarmed the stairwell, their limbs bending in grotesque angles to squeeze through the narrow space. They didn't follow him into the street. Instead, they stopped at the threshold, twitching in unison, heads tilted as though watching. One pressed its face against the cracked glass of the door, lips pulled into that same broken grin. Then, as if obeying some unspoken command, they scuttled back into the shadows above, retreating into the building's blackened ceiling voids. The footage ended with the door swinging slowly shut. Hader never returned to the apartment. He left the duffel bag behind somewhere on the street, running until his lungs burned and his legs gave way. The next morning, he checked into a cheap motel across town, paying in cash. He told no one where he had been, no one what he had seen. When friends asked about the move, he muttered something vague about bad landlords. He wanted to believe that leaving meant escaping, but sleep offered no relief. Every creak of the motel ceiling, every knock from the pipes, carried the same suffocating weight of something unseen, something waiting. Weeks later, he logged into his laptop one final time, scrolling through the corrupted camera files. Most wouldn't open, static, glitches, frozen frames. But one did. It was a clip from the last night, just before his desperate escape. The camera in his room, still aimed at the ceiling, had caught a final moment he hadn't noticed. After he fled, the creature lowered itself fully into the empty apartment, twitching, head jerking side to side. It bent toward the camera, wide eyes reflecting in the lens, and raised one long finger to its lips again. This time, in a rasping, broken whisper barely audible through the static, it said a single word, "Chill." Hader slammed the laptop shut and never opened it again. He left the motel a week later, moving from place to place, never staying long, never sleeping soundly. He never spoke of the creatures, not to friends, not to police, not even to himself in the quiet of an empty room. But sometimes, when he passed by certain buildings at night, he thought he saw shapes in the upper windows, pale, jerking forms pressed against the glass, watching. And when the city was silent enough, he swore he could still hear it, that slow, deliberate scratching just above the ceiling.